everybody. This is Pastor Brady Henderson, the senior pastor of the First Baptist Church in Gaston, South Carolina, located in the Midlands, in the best state in the Union. And so this is the Menorah Podcast. Just want to thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the 48th episode of the Menorah Podcast. Today is Thursday, January 23rd, 2025. And if you are listening to today's podcast, that means that you survived Snowpocalypse 2025. So hopefully you're doing okay from
the second snowpocalypse.
Yeah, the second. Yes,
we may have more to come.
Thank you. Yeah. So since you're listening, whether it's your first time or you've listened before, the purpose of the Menorah Podcast is to share the light, speak the light, and send the light of Jesus Christ all across the airwaves of the internet. And so Alan is here with me today, and we want to provide some content for you. We missed gathering for worship last night. I know that was a hard decision to make, but we felt like it was the best decision for everybody's safety involved, and usually being more cautious is usually the better way to go with that. So we missed you. Hopefully you have already checked out on our YouTube channel as well as Facebook, where we uploaded a devotional that I shared last night. Hopefully you were able to see that. We will pick up where we were supposed to be last night in Mark. So Mark chapter 9, verses 38 through 41. We will pick that up on Sunday as we look at a sermon entitled, "The Kingdom is Bigger Than You." And so we'll be looking at that on Sunday. But Alan, I want to talk to you a little bit today. There's a new book that I've been able to read through, and I have actually been able to guide a young man at our church here who I'm discipling, was able to, or still am, taking him through this book. But it's called Portraits of a Pastor, and Jason Allen is a general editor, but it has 9 total authors, and I just wanted to hit a few things about this. It talks about portraits of a pastor, but it also says the subtitle is the 9 essential roles of a church leader. So I don't want to just say a pastor. But one thing that kind of caught my eye about this that I just wanted to talk to about our listeners today and just kind of bring up on the podcast, on the back of the book, and like I said, you can purchase this. It's probably not at Mardell's yet. ChristianBookstore.com is what I use. I would encourage you to read through this book if you are in ministry or feel called to pastor or whatever the case may be. On the back of it, it says, what's demanded of you isn't necessarily what's required of you. And this has been sitting on my desk, and this is what caused me to pick up the book, was that back phrase there, what's demanded of you isn't necessarily what's required of you. And I have read that phrase, and I'm like, wow, what is demanded of me on a daily basis, or any church leader, that's not necessarily what the Bible says that I'm supposed to be doing and that God expects of me. So just want to kind of talk about this, kind of give a little book review, I guess, is essentially what we're doing here. I won't talk about all 9 chapters. Hopefully you'll pick this book up, and you can read through it on your own. Just wanted to kind of look through several different things that the book brings out in its pages and content. So here, the first one that kind of got to me, it talks about, obviously, portraits of a pastor. The first one is, it talks about the pastor as a husband and a father. And so Daniel Aiken, the president at Southeastern Seminary, wrote this. And so obviously he is awesome. And he talks about how he and his wife had been married since 1978 and they had children. And I know personally his son is a pastor in Georgia and all this kind of stuff. And so as a young person reading that, before I have children, obviously, is extremely important to me to make sure that I go ahead and create healthy boundaries in my ministry and in my life and family stuff and all of that, to where when I do have children, I will be able to lead them like I'm hopefully faithfully leading my wife. So I know I've heard this phrase before, and I know, Alan, you and I have talked about it. A pastor's number one ministry is at home with his wife and with his children. So this chapter talks a little bit about that. He gives a really good diagram on the scriptures here. It talks about how a pastor will love his wife. And of course, this isn't just a pastor. If you're a husband, right, you need to love your wife. And this book is definitely saturating the scriptures. It's very good about that and talks about all these kind of different specific things about the family. So any comments you have on that?
Well, I think the Bible is pretty clear in and of itself about how you treat your spouse, how you treat children, how you raise them. You yourself, of course, have done an outstanding job with passing that on to parents in the Family Matters that we've recently done, both 1.0 and 2.0.
Appreciate that. Yeah, that's really what we should have talked about today, right? Is a
Yeah.
review of Family Matters. Maybe we'll do that next week. Had a great time this past Friday with our young parents, and appreciate you, Alan, for volunteering and being a part of that. I guess I'll take a little break and pause in the book. Just seeing all those parents eager to talk about, well, not talk about, but learn, right? I know they had discussion questions and stuff, but one thing that pointed out to me, or that I felt like I saw Friday, was they were excited to
Mhm.
learn, and they were excited to be there, and nobody that I saw had the attitude of, oh, I'm a great parent, or, oh, I've already arrived. It was all, hey, I'm doing the best I can. Help me do better.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that is helpful is when you are in a situation and you surround yourself with people that are in a similar situation, that can give you some helpful hints and things like that. You can kind of network, they
Yeah.
call it now, with
Yeah.
others that may be facing or may have faced. You may be able to help them out. Maybe
Hmm.
they have a question of something that you faced and that how you've, you can say, well, we had the same situation. We tried this and it really blew up in our face. And then we tried this and it worked really well. So always when you're interacting with people and thinking in terms of that, always think about, well, I've been there. Sometimes it's easy to say, I know what you're going through when you really don't know
When you
what they're
really
going
don't.
through.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you can still say, hey, look, I had something similar. This is kind of how it happened for us, and this is what we did.
Yeah. I thought it was great. I thought it was good, and really enjoyed it, and just really appreciate the heart of our younger people. They're so open to learn. Most of them don't get offended very easily, and it's just really awesome. You can be really real with them in that environment.
Well, I think for so long we've not been real. For so long we've tried to put a lot of perfume on things that we really need to.
That is a great phrase, and you better put copyright on it because I am going to steal it.
Well,
I like that. We put perfume on things. I love that. It's good.
it's I'm probably the first to say if I have something that I need to talk about that is unpleasant, I'm probably going to talk about it in my head first.
Yeah.
I have never been a person that wants to assign blame. We do things bad all the time. We make mistakes all the time. And I'm not so into, well, this is your fault as I am. So next time this arises, we know we can treat it differently.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the outcome we're looking for.
Yep.
Oftentimes we try to take shortcuts.
Mm-hmm.
And guys, I'm going to tell you, I can't address much in terms of raising children, but I can say that that's probably one of the areas in your life that you want to take the least amount of shortcuts you can.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So let's get back to the book a little bit. I appreciate that detour. That was awesome. So of course the book Portraits of a Pastor, the 9 portraits it gives are preacher, shepherd, man of God, husband, father, missionary, leader, church historian, theologian, evangelist. The preacher one was really interesting to me because I teach our new members class here, and I spend so much time, well, 2 weeks really, discussing history. And when you look at church history and Baptist life, the word pastor really wasn't used in the beginning, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but I mean that is we had circuit quote unquote preachers, and those preachers worked in the fields with everybody else and had their farms, and they didn't use the word bivocational, but that's what they were. And I think it's very interesting that it mentions here on page 59, it says pastor search committees were once called pulpit committees. A call to the ministry was a call to preach, and the pastor was often called simply the preacher. Back in the 1800s and early 1900s, up until World War II, of Baptist life, 9 times out of 10, the pastor didn't do the funeral, right? The pastor didn't do those things. He would do a wedding, and a wedding was nothing like it's known today. Back then, it was literally Okay, you can go to the courthouse for the justice of the peace, or you can go to the front steps of the church. I mean, and the front steps of the church literally might be a few planks of wood going into a one-room building. And so a lot of the time, pastors did not do funerals and did not care for the people. And that's not a knock against them. It is actually following, if you want to be biblically correct, it is following the New Testament model that the church takes care of the church and that the church loves on the church. And so that is a part about the pastor that people have really negated, in my opinion. And what I mean by that is they have negated the responsibility, the role, and the importance of preaching in the life of a pastor. I mean, we think about the administration, we think about visiting the sick, and all that has its place. But I think we have to be careful to remember, and this book points that out in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, talks about qualifications for an elder, which I was looking at a few days ago. This past Sunday, it was a year ago last Sunday, that we were in Titus, and I preached that sermon, Qualifications of an Elder. It was very interesting that I know of seven church committees, pastor search committees, that actually use that sermon as their checklist when they're looking at a candidate. So I thought that was cool. I didn't know that, and obviously some of them came to me. Only seven that I know of, but that's pretty cool that they would use that sermon outline as they're interviewing candidates and looking at different things of that nature, because it comes from the scripture. But it's important, the fact that a pastor actually be able to teach. I know of churches and people that they might have a person in the pulpit that's not a great preacher, and I'm not dogging that, but meaning, they don't work at it, that's not their thing, but man, they're good with people. Man, they're good at visiting. Man, they're good at all the other things. But I think we need to remember that that's what a pastor's called to do, is to preach. First and foremost, preach and teach the Word of God. And so that's got to be important. It has here, the author of this chapter suggests 4 essential remarks of good biblical exposition, meaning your preacher needs to have these 4 things in his sermon. Number 1, the necessity of accurately interpreting the text. I think that's important. Number 2, the necessity of the central point in the sermon and the sermon's main points to be derived from the text. What does that mean? Text-driven, right? That's really important. Number 3, the necessity of the sermon's application to come from the text and for the text to be brought to bear on the congregation. Fourthly, more tenuously, the priority of lectico catunia, or aka verse-by-verse exposition. And I think that is good preaching. It's not getting red in the face. It also says this, and I quote, "When I prepare sermons, I think through exactly who will be in the audience," and end quote. I do that every week. Not necessarily actually individual people, but I think of the 80-year-old widow, and I think of the 8-year-old who got bullied at school this past week. Try to think of those 2 individuals, not by name, but everybody else in between, and asking you these questions. Will people be able to grasp this biblical concept as I present it, or do I need to simplify it? Another question, what does this truth have to say to the young couple who's struggling in their early years of marriage? And then what might this concept be expressed in a way that is encouraging the middle-aged woman who is recently diagnosed with cancer? Those are all things that we kind of have to consider in our preaching. So I think it's important. Yes, I think pastoring is very important. I'm not negating that at all, but you're called to be a preacher, called to preach the gospel.
Well, I believe we've talked about this before, and I think the relationship, and I'm speaking personally now. I think a relationship that I have with you, your words are going to carry much more freight than a preacher that I listen to on the radio or that I watch on the web or whatever. So yes, there is a very important component to being a pastor, rather than just showing up at the hospital and people feeling like you need to meet every need in their entire life.
Yeah, which is it's not attainable. Sorry to interrupt.
Well, yeah, and I think that there are several things that go on. I want to go back to a couple of things you said in looking back at the history. The way we've changed tends to be reflected in the needs of the people. Mm-hmm. And I'm not speaking of people as in the consumers of preaching, so to speak. I'm speaking in terms of people in general. But, once we started with the full-time pastors, they had time to do that.
Yeah.
More time to do that.
Yeah, and I definitely think that's where we got in trouble. Idle time is a bad enemy. Just to interrupt there, I do think they had more time, but I also think, depending on the church context, especially mill churches, and if you're in a mill church, I'm sorry, but yes, I am targeting you here. The mills were run with such a business-like structure that their churches were run that same way.
Well, oftentimes the mill churches were run by the mill.
Exactly.
The mills who
exactly.
paid the pastor.
Exactly. So in saying that, if the pastor couldn't study all day, like, well, what are you doing? Why are you studying? Why aren't you with people? Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? And Jesus was with the people, so I do think there's a time for that. I do believe that. But
he ministered to a number of folks.
Exactly. And I think that's important. I think the pastor should minister to people, but I think the number one priority of that is ministering through the Word. And you have to prepare to do that. In other words, I think you could tell if I walked up Sunday morning and I spent 2 hours with the text. I would hope that it would be recognizable that I didn't spend a lot more time than that. Because I think it's important. I think it's important to give that study and to give that time. And as the Apostle Paul put it in Ephesians 4, 11 through 12, or 11 through 13, that the work of a pastor is to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. And I think that's really important. So we've just hit a few portraits today, and hopefully if the snow's still around, maybe you'll go out and play in it. But we're going to pick back up next week and do a little review on family matters and talk about that and how all of that went. But thank you so much for listening to the podcast today. Hopefully we'll see you Sunday, because we really did miss you this past Wednesday night. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you on Sunday. This has been the Menorah Podcast. Podcast seeks share light, send the light, and speak the light of Jesus Christ all across the airways of the internet. Thank you so much. We'll see you soon.